poetry is a double-edged sword which liberates the individual, at the same time leaves the individual ungrounded, says Emily Dickinson. Today, we are discussing a Dickensian poem titled Safe in Their Alabaster Chambers, which is prescribed to the MA English students as part of their American Literature course in the semester 2. Dickinson is famous for her unique style of poetry and as well as her unique lifestyle. Dickinson belongs to the 19th century American poet and can be counted as one among the most important American poets. Dickinson, in her poetry, make use of unique styles by incorporating various punctuations like commas, hyphens, capitalizing words, even such formatic elements are added onto her poetry. Today, we'll be discussing her poem, Safe in the Alabaster Chambers. We know that Dickinson is so much occupied with the theme of death, nature, love in her poetry. Likewise, this poem is also speaking about death. Interestingly, without even mentioning the word death even a single time in the poem. Over to the poem. The poem. Safe in their alabaster chambers, untouched by morning and untouched by noon, sleep the meek members of the resurrection, a rafter of satin and rafter of straw. Grand go the years in the crescent above them, worlds scoop their arcs, and firmaments row. Diadems drop, and doges surrender, soundless as dots on a disk of snow. Here, the whole poem is speaking about some people who have passed away from a community. But nowhere the poet is using the word death. Instead, very beautifully, she portrays the life of a dead person, or she portrays the condition of a dead person deep inside his or her grave, and portrays it against the changing world. For a person who has passed away, for a person who is dead, according to Dickinson, the time is freezed, while for the outside world, the time keeps on changing. The world witnesses the change of seasons, the change of the kingdoms, fall of kings, etc. While for the dead, everything is freezed, the time is freezed, every events are freezed, nothing keeps on changing. So here we see Dickinson bringing in the major theme of the impermanence of world. Nothing is permanent in the world, things keep on changing. As we know, Dickinson is very good in the celebration of the theme of death through her poetry. This poem is also a typical Dickensian poem with its theme, as well as the various formatic elements that Dickinson has brought into the poem. Interestingly, you will find that the poem is named as Safe in Their Alabaster Chambers. We know that Dickinson, very few of her poems were published with her own initiative. Many of her poems were published posthumously and was titled by someone else, not by Dickinson herself. And we find that, interestingly, the first line of the poem plays the role of the title of Dickinson's poem. There is no difference here also. You'll find the first line of the poem taken as the title of the poem also. So we'll be analyzing this poem in little more detail. As I'm analyzing it, I would like to examine the optimism that the poem conveys. Since the major theme that the poem is speaking about is death, we often commit a mistake, or we often read this poem and associate it with gloomy nature or kind of pessimism. But nowhere this poem is speaking about a gloomy attitude or pessimism. We find that the poem is so optimistic, and I'm trying to examine this poem in such a perspective that it is a poem of optimism rather than pessimism, though it deals with death. So we can divide the poem into three parts. The first part, we see the dead are described as trapped because they are inside a chamber, which is no silly chamber, it's an alabaster chamber. Alabaster, something which is very luxurious. The alabaster chamber is, of course, the grave, and inside the grave, they are inside the coffins, whose rafters are made of satin and of luxurious stones. You see the elements of luxury being brought in by the poet in the very first stanza, in the very onset of the poem itself. Over to the second part of the poem, we find that the second part of the poem is concentrating on the life going around the dead person, life going around or the time passing as a person is laying dead inside the grave, inside the coffin. The time is frozen for the dead, while for the others, for the living people, the time moves on, changes come to their life. So we find the poet pinpointly spotting out each and every changes that occurs in the world. Now we have the third portion or the third part of the poem, which notes the universe going on and the dead are insignificant in comparison. We find the universe developing while the dead are long forgotten. Though they are long forgotten, they have a kind of hope that we see here in the poem. As we discuss the themes, we'll see what is the hope that the dead people have as they keep, as they stay inside the alabaster chamber. We see that there is a theme of Christianity. Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, verse 5. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Thus goes the Bible. Here, Dickinson, who was a believer of Christianity, brings in the theme of Christianity or the theme of resurrection, which is so much associated with Christianity here. According to the Christian belief, they believe that Lord Jesus would come and would resurrect the people. Here you have the dead people lying inside the grave, inside the alabaster chambers, waiting resurrection. So it's not a gloomy waiting that they are doing, or it's not a gloomy thing that we discuss here. It's actually they are hoping for a future. They have a future. They are waiting for the arrival of the day of resurrection. Along with Christ, these people who are dead will also be resurrected as promised in the Bible. And we have seen that Dickinson is using a particular line, the meek will be resurrected. Those meek people, those innocent people, as promised by Matthew in Bible, would inherit earth, or they would be risen along with Jesus. This is the belief that Emily Dickinson is putting forward through her poem, and is also trying in a way to create or to end the poem in an optimistic note. At the same time, as I have mentioned, the poet is also bringing in the theme of impermanence of the world. We have seen that the things around the world would keep on changing. There would be changes that is happening, that the kingdoms would fail, the seasons may change, that the lords may die, or the lords or great emperors, the crowns they may lose their crowns, but the dead people have the time frozen or their life frozen, and they would have a good time without being subjected to such changes deep inside the grave, inside their very comfortable, very luxurious coffin. Of course, death, because we have seen that nowhere in the poem Dickinson is bringing in the term death, but still we have seen that the whole poem is talking about the theme of death. We know that Dickinson is very peculiar with her use of such themes like love, death, nature. These are the major themes that we see when it comes to Dickensian poetry. And we see that death is celebrated here also, like many of her other poems. For example, Because I Could Not Stop for Death. So these are the major themes that come into play when it comes to the poem. And of course, I would like to add that the poem is, as many of the critics have analyzed the poem, it's not simply a poem which is speaking about the gloomy aspect of death, the negative aspect or the agony or the sorrow associated with death. The people deep inside the coffin are not sad. They're happy, and they're happily waiting for resurrection. They're happily awaiting resurrection there inside the coffin. So nowhere in the poem or no aspect of the poem is making you to associate the poem with agony and sorrow. Rather, it ends with it is bringing forth a very happy note as well. Interestingly, Emily Dickinson has brought in Trop of circle in the poem. Trop of circle. Trop means a recurring image that appears in a poem or a story or a novel. So you can see this trop of circle that is being brought into the poem. You can see that the poet using the words like crescent. Crescent, that means the crescent that is on top of the grave, which can be associated with the sky, which can be associated with the change of seasons. The crescents change, says Dickinson. So you can associate this with the change of seasons, or this can be associated with the heaven, which is on top of the grave, that the people deep inside the grave, the dead, are looking up to and waiting for their resurrection. Now you have the scoop, arcs, row, disc, life, etc. So these terms actually are associated with the drop of cycle. You know that scoop, we have Dickinson speaking about scoop, we have Dickinson speaking about arcs, etc. We'll just examine by using the lines from the poem. Over the second stanza, you would find that grand go the ears in the crescent above them. Crescent above them means the sky, or you can take it as the heaven. Worlds scoop their arcs. Worlds scoop their arcs and firmaments row. That means the world is all like a circle, and there is a kind of a cycle that happens in the world, or this cycle keeps on changing. The seasons keeps on changing. Diadems drop and dodges surrender. Kingdoms fall and kings fail. So here you have words like crescent, scoop, arcs, etc. associating with the image or the trop of a cycle, which you can associate with the life or the life cycle as well. And later we see that life, the impermanence of life is also treated there, because the people do not have any promise of an eternal life. You have the people dying, and the death of the people is making no impact on the events happening in the world. You find that the death of the people are more like a soundless as dot on a disk of snow. It's more like a simple dot falling, a dot of snow falling over a disk of snow. That is a very feeble, very light, very subtle influence or subtle change that death is bringing onto the world. So how silly is this death when the world is busy celebrating, or world is busy having its own affairs. So you have the world that is keeping on moving, but when if you have people taking birth, you have people dying, but the death of a person is not at all impacting the world. You would find that here in the last part of the poem, the poet is actually trying to belittle or to show that how insignificant is death in such a busy world. So these are the major aspects of the poem, and over to the next section, where I would like to analyze this poem as something which ends in an optimistic note rather than gloomy note. And the first point that would signify the optimism of the poem is the theme of resurrection, which is related to Christianity, that is brought in. You would find that in the poem, you see that the sleep, the meek, members of resurrection. Sleep is the only word that Dickinson is bringing in, which can some way be related to death. Nowhere other than this line you would find any word associated to death. You find that they are sleeping in alabaster chambers which are very luxurious. They are untouched by morning and untouched by noon. And see how this coffin is made. They have the rafter of satin. The chambers, a rafter, which usually of a house is made up of wood, but here the chamber, the coffin's rafter is made up of satin and roof of stone. It has got stone roofs. So it's more a grave. And you have the meek members waiting for resurrection there. And here you have the reference of meek, which is connected to the biblical verse of Matthew chapter 5, verse 5. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. And it is from this point, the meek members who wait for resurrection, actually we have we have the poem's optimistic note, which overpowers the typical gloomy, sorrowful mood that a poem dealing with death would create. So this poem that you have before you is actually a poem which was written in 1861. Before writing this poem, Dickinson had written the same poem back in 1859, and she actually rewrote this poem in the way that you see on screen. In the first draft that she created back in 1859, the first stanza was more similar, but in the second stanza, she was rather than speaking about the emperors or empires or the fall of various kings, she was relating her poem little more with nature. We would see that in the 1859 version, we find that the version has got a kind of a riddling and cheerful images in the second stanza. That means the last stanza of the poem has got little more difference. It is having little more cheerful images which are more associated with nature. Light laughs the breeze. That means over the grave, over the coffin, over the grave, you have the light falling. Light is falling over the grave, and you have a slight breeze. Babbles the bee. You can hear the hissing of the bees, but the dead ones cannot, while the alive ones can. Pipe the sweet birds of innocent melody. You can hear the innocent melodies of the birds also. So these three images that Dickinson is putting in her 1859 version is also in a way adding to the optimistic tone of the poem. So I would like to say that this poem is wonderfully portrayed by Dickinson as an optimistic poem which is speaking about death and also focusing on the impermanence nature of world, while the dead one have the time and space that is being freezed, and they spend their time awaiting resurrection. Thank you.